So it's finally time to get started. Thank you all for joining me today. It's not a big crowd, but I'm sure we'll have a productive webinar. So let's first take a look at what I have prepared for today. And this would be the agenda. So I wanted to give you some general information about the exam. You probably know this already, but just a short recap and to answer some of the questions that many of you are asking in the Q&A section or through private messages. Also some preparation tips, some ideas that can help you focus on the right thing and save you some time and probably also some money. Some exam tips, and then we'll go into the live Q&A. Feel free during the first part of the webinar to ask any questions in the group chat. I'll answer them as well. But also when we're starting with Q&As, you can also raise your hand and you can ask a live question. And I will actually prefer if you would like to test your microphone and to ask a live question directly, not by using the chat, but by using your computer and your microphone. So let's get started with the first part, and that will be some information regarding the exams. So I'm discussing here two separate exams, the PSM1. Many of you are taking PSM1, but also the PSPO one. The first one is $150. The product owner certification is $200 per attempt. It means that if you, for whatever reason, fail the exam, you will have to pay the $150 or the $200. But I'm sure that if you're following along with the course, you're attending these webinars, you will have absolutely no issues passing these exams with a high score right from the beginning. When it comes to registration, anyone can register. There are absolutely no requirements. There are no courses that you have to take or anything like that. It is absolutely an open book online exam, which means that you don't have to have your webcam turned on, or there's practically no way that somebody can check what you're actually doing. But anyway, you're taking the exam because you're learning about Scrum, you're well prepared. But this is a question I had a lot. Is this an open book exam? It's not advertised as an open book online exam, but practically is, because nobody can check what you're doing. But unfortunately, because of the time constraints, you won't have a lot of time to go through everything. So if you are well prepared, you will not even need to look at your own notes or at the Scrum guide or anything else. You will just focus on the contents of the exam questions. For the exam, the passing score is 85%. So there are quite a few questions that you can get wrong. There's a time limit of 60 minutes. And there are 80 questions that you need to answer in those 80 minutes, pretty similar to the preparation test that you will find inside the course. The question format is, as you see in the simulations, sometimes there's multiple choice, or sometimes there are simple multiple answers that you need to select, or true or false. Most of the time, the questions will indicate how many answers you need to select, but there can also be a few questions where it says select all answers that apply, and then you will need to select all those answers. Additionally, if a question has, for example, 2 correct answers, and you only get 1 right, you will not get any partial points. The entire question will be marked as invalid. So no partial points for this exam. And also, once you pass the exam, I'm sure it will be quite easy for you because you're all very smart and attending webinars and taking online courses. The certification has a lifetime validity. You don't have to renew it. You don't have to do anything. You can just keep it, add it to your LinkedIn profile, print it out if you need it, and it will be for you during your entire professional career. Now, for many of you are not native English speakers and may have issues with some of the questions. Unfortunately, I have the impression that sometimes the questions are not testing Scrum, but are testing your understanding of the English language, which is actually a pity. You cannot copy-paste questions in your own translator or something similar. But I heard you can use the Google Translate plugin. So you can install the plugin in your browser, and then the plugin can automatically translate the website for you. And just in case, if you want to give it a try in advance to see if that would work, and just to get yourself familiar with the interface, all the open assessments on scrum.org have practically almost the same interface as the real exam. So there's no way to mark questions. You will have to write them down on paper. There's the list of questions is always below the question that you're currently answering, and so on and so forth. So if you're familiar with that, during the exam, we'll have no surprises. And if the Google Translate plugin or any other translation plugin works on that page, it probably will work during the online exam, during the live exam as well. So a few ideas regarding your preparation. And this is mostly based on some of the things I noticed some of you doing. And overall, what I wanted to give you some ideas on what you should focus on. And first of all, you should focus on the open assessments that you find on scrum.org. There are actually quite a few open assessments that you can take there. Not all of them are relevant for the exam. For example, the Scrum Open is the most relevant, but it's also worth looking at other assessments just to try out different kind of questions and to look up for some information in the Scrum guide and just to understand overall Scrum and Agile better. But also, it's super important that you focus on the practice tests within the course, and you will find plenty of them, and all the practice tests take you through the entire content of the Scrum guide, the Scrum glossary, and all the other required materials that are relevant for the exam. So they ensure that you are actually well prepared in terms of going through the most important things, so that during the exam, you will not be surprised. Hopefully, you will not be surprised by many things. There are always a bit of surprises. Nobody can anticipate that. But overall, you have an idea of what this exam is about, and you will have absolutely no issue into passing it. And the Scrum guide is super important. You need to read the Scrum guide more than 2 times. You need to go back to the Scrum guide and not read it like a book, but look at particular sections. So for example, if you're doing some open assessments, or you're doing some practice tests, and you notice that you're getting some questions wrong. For example, what are the responsibilities of the product owner? Then you go back to the Scrum guide and read that particular section regarding what is the product owner responsible for. Or you're confused about the definition of done. Then you go into the Scrum guide and look again and read again only that section that's regarding the definition of done. So you don't have to read the entire Scrum guide from the beginning to the end. You just have to focus on some particular parts, some particularities of the Scrum guide, because it's really, really important that you invest some time reading the Scrum guide, understanding the Scrum guide, and not, for example, memorizing questions or memorizing answers. It's about understanding, not by understanding the contents of the Scrum guide, not memorizing and doing tons and tons of questions. And some of you are really over-preparing. So don't over-prepare. Don't do more than I have suggested in this course, because I have every day maybe tens of students telling me that they have passed the exam and telling me that the contents of the course work. And this is the only thing that you should focus on. And be aware of like online sites where they post exam questions apparently, or similar exam questions, but they do not give you an explanation. These are the most dangerous ones, because first of all, you can get confused about which is the correct answer or what are the responsibility of a particular law and so on. By not having an explanation, you cannot go to the Scrum guide and verify that the respective answer is the correct one, because you don't have like the context. You don't know from where is this. Why is it A and not B? Or why is it B and not C? I'm getting a lot of questions regarding this, and I definitely do not recommend, if you are taking any other prep tests that are not within my courses, then be really careful. If there's no explanation, there's already something that's not okay with that. So don't get fooled by that. The point is not to memorize questions. It is to understand Scrum. And this is why I'm here. This is why I'm trying to support you to understand Scrum and to get over this exam together. And overall, not only to take this exam, but to take Scrum into your projects, into your organizations, and to really have a real benefit and a real impact from taking and learning these things. Additionally, if you're looking at different sources for questions, you can get confused, and this can really make you feel unsure. So again, the contents, the questions that you have inside the course, they really take you through the entire content of the Scrum guide and the entire material that's important. And if you go back and invest more time into looking at a Scrum guide and understanding it, you can spare yourself, first of all, money by purchasing additional questions, or by looking at online simulators that do not give you explanations and really try to confuse, or not intentionally, of course, but can end up with you being confused regarding different things. So the Scrum guide is the most important thing that you should be focusing on. So you should be trusting me, because I'm getting reviews and messages from students that have passed the exam every day. And they come on the online course, they come on LinkedIn, they come everywhere. They are really, I'm getting this every day, and people are telling me that what I'm preaching here is the right thing to do, and probably the best way to prepare for this exam, the most effective way to prepare for this exam. So this is why I'm emphasizing the do's and the don'ts for preparing for this one. So the next question that many of you have is, okay, I've taken the course, I went through all these questions, I did all the open assessments, am I ready? And sometimes I'm getting messages like, well, I have now 93% or 95%. Am I ready for the exam? And I would say, typically not. If you have 93, 95%, even 97, there still may be something that is not clear. So your target should be 100%. Take the open assessments, take the questions inside the course, and identify the areas where you are unsure. And if there's something that is not clear, look it in the Scrum guide. If you cannot find it in the Scrum guide, reach out to me, and I will point you in the direct direction, or explain some weird parts of the Scrum guide that maybe aren't that clear for you. So it's really important that you try to go towards 100%. And when you have in the open assessments and in the course, in all the quizzes and everything, almost 100%, it means that you are really prepared, that you have understood everything. Of course, not by memorizing questions, but by understanding the Scrum guide. Finally, some exam tips, things that you should consider when taking the exam. So first of all, it's really important that you take the exam in a time of the day when you're not tired, not after coming from work or working the entire day. Nobody's coming from work anymore nowadays, apparently. But I generally advise doing it in the morning, just to be as relaxed as possible. Don't do practice tests till the day before at 2 o'clock in the morning. It's really not necessary. If you followed my advice, if you understood the Scrum guide, if you're doing well in the open assessments and in the practice tests, you most likely have absolutely no issues during the exam as well. Additionally, you don't have a lot of time. You saw there are a lot of questions, but not so much time. So you have to be very careful to keep an eye on the clock to see how things are progressing. And of course, some students are a bit faster and managed to do it quite fast. I had students who said, hey, I did everything in 30 minutes or 35 minutes. And other students are like, I lost every last second of the exam because I didn't have any time to go back and review anything. So it really depends from students to student. The real exam is, of course, harder in the sense that you are under this time pressure. You paid $150 or $200. This is the real thing. It's a different mindset. So overall, try not wasting time. And one way you can do that is by being prepared. If you have everything you need on your table, pen, paper, if you need some water, chocolate, and also make sure that your computer is plugged in, that you don't run out of electricity in the middle of exam or have to run for cables. Every second matters. So try to be very mindful how you spend your time. And when it comes to the exam questions, the practice tests try to help you understand the kind of questions you will get in the exam. Of course, they will not be the same questions. They will have a similar difficulty. Some students even said that the questions in my test were harder than the actual exam. I think that's a very good compliment. But overall, what you pay attention to is reading the questions carefully. Even if you think you saw this question somewhere else, no matter where, do not start assuming that you already know the answer. Read a question. First, check how many answers are required. This may sound quite obvious, but you might find yourself in the exam selecting things without actually first checking, oh, I have to select 2 or I have to select 3 answers. And for more complex questions that may surprise you, always try to think about the contents of the Scrum Guide. Do not think what is the logical thing to do, because sometimes you get these situations and you'll think, oh, this would make sense to do it like this. This is what I would do if I would have this situation in my organization, my company. This is not what the exam is asking you. The exam is asking you the contents of the Scrum Guide and the spirit of Scrum and Agile overall, not what your personal opinion is on how to solve a particular problem. So don't be tricked by such questions by thinking how you would solve it. Think about the Scrum Guide. And you need to understand that you need to select the best answer. The best answer isn't always the perfect answer and isn't always the exact same answer that you find in the Scrum Guide. But from the options that are available, you have to select the best answer. And also for questions where you are not sure which one is the correct answer, and typically these are questions where 2 or 3 answers are required. For these particular questions, I recommend eliminating options that are obviously wrong. So you know the contents of the Scrum Guide, and by looking at the respective options, you can say, okay, the first one is not, the fourth one is not, and I now have 3 remaining options and I have to select 2. And this obviously increases your chances of getting the right answer. And this is super important. So don't forget about this. Take this process of elimination when you're not sure about questions. It will make your life easier, regardless of how many options out there. Mentally try to remove them so that it makes it easier for you to select the right one. We are in the interesting part of the webinar where you guys can start asking questions. I already received some questions that I will try to answer in the beginning. Of course, you can start raising your hand if you would like to ask a live question. You can raise your hand and then I will unmute you. And actually, this is the preferred way on how I want to go with this, to make it a conversation and not to make it everything in the chat. I'm anyway talking too much. So I would like to hear your questions as well. So I received from someone 3 questions. I think we can go over them pretty quickly. The Scrum Master can be part of the development team, true or false? This answer is true. The Scrum Master can be part of the development team. And it's important to understand that this is also specified in the Scrum Guide. It's not directly specified. It's when you're looking at a section with the development team size. And it's mentioning that if the Scrum Master is doing work in the backlog, then it's, of course, is part of the development team as well. So, yes, is this a good idea? No, it's not a good idea. Typically, mixing roles in Scrum is not a good idea. This is why roles exist in the first place. The second question. Let's say that your sprint is 2 weeks in duration and the work that you originally planned to do is already completed. So all the work in the sprint backlog is done and the sprint still has a few days to go. What happens? And what happens in this situation is that the sprint length is fixed. So this cannot be changed. So if the sprint is like a rhythm. It has to always go. If it's 2 weeks, it's every other 2 weeks so that everyone in the organization knows that it's 2 weeks. And if it happens to end, if the work is already done, then the sprint doesn't stop. It still continues. This is not a problem that teams usually have. The development team can still pull work from the product backlog if there's enough capacity still in the sprint. Typically, there's enough work so that this is not an issue, but the sprint doesn't stop 2 days or something like that before the time box expires. The sprint itself is a special event and has this way of working. Finally, the third question, if any work that has not been completed for whatever reason, what happens with this work? Is it reviewed and reestimated? So if at the end of the sprint there are still product backlog items that are still not according to definition of done. First of all, they will not be demonstrated during the sprint review meeting. So it's very important to remember this. And what happens is that it will be put back into the product backlog. And of course, any work in a product backlog has to be estimated. What's also important to remember is that this will not be automatically added to the next sprint. So the product owner may decide, for whatever reason, that work that wasn't completed in the last sprint, maybe it's not valuable anymore. So don't automatically assume that any work that is not done, it will be done in the next sprint. In practice, it may happen, but this is not always the case. I've already seen some hands here being raised, so let's unmute and see how this goes.
Hi, am I unmuted? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Awesome. So this is wonderful. I just wanted to thank you for hosting these first. And then I wanted to check with you something about the interface of the exam. So you did mention at the beginning of this that the interface is very similar to the open assessment that is there in scrum.org. But I have also read reviews and students giving the exam saying that when they give the real exam, it's way slower. And the way you go around the interface of the exam makes you slower than the open assessment. Is it like that? Or is it exactly similar to what we see in open assessment?
That's a great question. And actually, for whatever reasons, this tends to vary. So some students report that it does take a few seconds to load the next question. I think I even mentioned in the course that, you may have up to like 5 seconds of delay. So you're like clicking and waiting for this thing to load. It really depends, but I would say typically is a bit slower than what you see in the open assessments. I don't know why. It seems to be like the same platform, but the real exam may have this delay. I don't know if it's intentional or just a technical thing. So okay. I would love to hear back from you how it went. You can imagine I'm not taking this exam like every week, like you guys are doing. So I'm really relying on your feedback regarding what's still accurate regarding the platform. But this is my latest information that I have regarding how things work.
Sounds good. Thank you.
You're welcome. So let's hear another question.
Hi, Valentin. This is Mamta here. Can you hear me?
Hi, I can hear you.
Yes. So it was me who sent those 3 questions. So thank you so much for taking it up. And thank you for hosting this webinar. I think this is really very useful for someone like me who is fairly new to Scrum. So there is a lot that I'm learning from your videos and the practice test and other tips. So thank you so much for doing such a great work. I think regarding my third question, Valentin, I'm still a little confused. So the reason why I'm getting confused, because in Scrum Guide, it clearly says that in sprint review, yes, we don't demo the work that has not been done, obviously, for the obvious reasons. We only demo the work that has been completed and has been done. But it also, somewhere I read this, and I don't remember where, it did say that in sprint review, if any work has not been completed for whatever the reason is, then this would be reviewed and re-estimated in the product backlog. Now, the confusion that I'm getting is that would you be reviewing and re-estimating that piece of work in sprint review itself, or would you do that as a part of product backlog grooming? I think that's my question.
And that's a great question. Well, I think part of the confusion is that when you're reading in the Scrum Guide, what happens when you cancel a sprint, I think there is explicitly mentioned that any work that's not done will be re-estimated.
Right.
In the sprint review itself, the product owner will typically, of course, mention the work that hasn't been done. So, of course, it's valuable to demonstrate, to show to the stakeholders what has been done And it's so important to inspect only work that has been done, because if the stakeholders inspect things that are like partially working, they may have the impression that these things are actually part of the product increment that will be available soon to the customers. So just to keep things transparent, I think this is the reason why things are not demonstrated, even if they, let's say, for example, technically speaking, only the tests are missing. Okay, the thing is working itself, but the tests are missing. Still, it's not considered done. It's not being showed. It's being mentioned. This and this and this has not been completed in the sprint. And I don't think the sprint review is the right opportunity to re-estimate things. If the exact same items are still relevant for the next sprint, they can be put back into the product backlog. And then during the sprint planning meeting, the development team can do actually what would look like a backlog refinement, in the sense that they look what is the content of the product backlog. And if things need to be re-estimated, they probably would re-estimate it, because it would make sense to know the amount of work that they will pull into the sprint. So this may be, but as far as I know, the exam questions will not go into such detailed questions regarding what happens into all these scenarios. So
right. Yeah, because I think I read it somewhere else in some other online tool or something. So that's why I was raising this as a concern, because you are right, the sprint guide, the Scrum guide doesn't talk about that. It only mentions that the work that has not been done, the product owner would just explain what has not been done, but they don't talk about anything, reviewing the work that is not done. So thank you so much, Valentin.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
No problem. I think I still have a few questions that I need to answer here. So this is coming from Chris. In Scrum, each sprint has a maximum of 1 month time box. The development team aims for a potentially releasable deliverable. Apart from development and internal testing, would it be required to do user acceptance testing in a real IT development before system launch? So, yes, that's actually quite a good question. So, user acceptance testing is typically the highest level of testing that you can do for a product. It either involves a sort of degree of automation, or you can even have like real people trying out the product before it goes to production. If we're talking about software, we'll have people installing the software, or trying the website, or trying the app on their phones, or this thing. Now, when it comes to done, so we know every product increment must be done. And what that means is that done includes any testing on any work that needs to be done before it ends up to the end users, before it ends up through customers, or being downloadable online, or in an app store, or wherever. So it's important to see user acceptance testing as still part of the development process. And in most IT companies, this higher level of testing is automated. And there are many organizations out there that have absolutely no issues using Scrum and releasing even multiple times a day. So this is, again, something that may be confusing for most of you, because you would expect that using Scrum, you can only have a product increment at the end of the sprint. And this is actually a requirement. So, of course, at the end of the sprint, there should be a product increment, but there can also be a product increment done anytime during the sprint. And in software projects, by using automated testing, inclusive acceptance testing, you can release products to production without any issues, even multiple times a day. So even small changes, they can respect the definition of done. The definition of done, typically, it is something technical, and we'll say, for example, all the unit tests are green, or all the unit tests must cover 80% of the code, or things like this. So many things can be automated, and this helps a lot. Of course, it's not directly relevant to Scrum right now, but just to answer this question, testing, any kind of testing that is relevant for the product must be done in the sprint. So we have here another hand. So let's see another question. Hello?
Hi, Valentine. This is
Hi.
Mamta again. Sorry to interrupt. But
No problem.
you were just answering this question, the previous one, right? And you said that you can also release the product increment during the sprint. Now, if that situation happens, would the product owner take that decision to release the product increment, or it would be done by the development team? In this case, execution, if they decide to release.
Yes. So typically, it really depends. So, for example, with software, you can deploy software somewhere, but for example, make the respective feature not available to the users. That would not necessarily be considered a product increment. But of course, it does make sense to have the product owner involved. And what you need to understand is that the product owner isn't this person that has like a different interest from the rest of the development team. Well, it really depends on how much time the product owner can dedicate and be actually physically present with the team. Most of the time, the communication with the product owner is on a day-to-day and multiple times a day basis. So the product owner will typically know everything that is being done. And there can also be this agreement with the development team that they can deploy a certain level of features without having like the explicit approval of the product owner, because they may be like very small things. Some of them, they may not have a big impact on the user. Maybe it's just a small text that has changed, or a new button is, instead of red, is green. So the level of changes, especially if you go at this micro level of small changes that go live all the time, this will not be an issue. And of course, this is overall in Scrum. You need to understand Scrum as this collaboration, this spirit of everyone is working towards a common goal. And the product owner isn't like the adversary or something similar. No, the product owner is collaborating all the time with the developing team on any problems that arise during the sprint. And yeah, hopefully that answers the question in regards to that.
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Okay, great. So let me see here another question. On my Scrum team, the business analyst, I assume, writes the user stories well ahead of the sprint, and UI team is doing the coding. Also, the services developer works ahead of the UI team. Is that okay? Well, it doesn't look to be okay, because first of all, there's not clear what the role of the product owner is. So there's nothing wrong with writing user stories or product backlog items well ahead of the sprint. This is more or less the typical way how product development works. The product owner will have a lot of ideas and will put them into the product backlog and collaborate with the stakeholders to try to understand what are the most important features that need to be done. And of course, it would order product backlog. So writing user stories and of course also refining them with the development team, it's simply part of the process. Now, for me, it's looked like the business analyst is the product owner. So maybe you can clarify that. But apart from that, it seems to be okay. There's also services developer. If that's an individual person that is working on a product and not part of a particular team, of course, that's again not okay, because only a development team can work on a product. Also, multiple development teams can work on the same product. But you wouldn't typically have one lead developer or one developer that does work outside of the team that's working on the same product. So overall, what you've described here doesn't seem like the best approach. So let me look at some other questions. Give me just a second. So I have here another question and another source of confusion regarding the definition of done. Who creates a definition of done? The Scrum Guide gives conflicting information on who should create the definition of done. The Scrum Guide, under the increment portion of the Scrum artifact section, it says at the end of a sprint, the new increment must be done, which means it must be in a usable condition. supporting that statement under the definition of done, it says, this is the definition of done for the Scrum team, and so on. But then later it says that the development team is supposed to create the definition of done. So who creates what and when? The Scrum Guide is very specific. So if you're asked in the exam who creates the definition of done, and you're giving the option to select from the Scrum Master, the Product Owner, and the developer team, definitely the development team is the correct answer. And this is because it's directly specified in the Scrum Guide if you read that part. What you need to understand is that the development team is not alone. I was previously mentioning the development team is part of the Scrum team. It's collaborating all the time with the product owner. So for example, if the product owner comes with a non-functional requirement, for example, the users or the stakeholders are complaining that the application is too slow, or maybe the security is not okay, or many other issues, other non-functional aspects of the product, it could be in the definition of done. A product owner can raise this issue with the development team and say, hey, look, I think we have a performance problem with this, with what you're building here. Users, customers are opening the website and it takes 5 seconds to load the shopping cart. That's not okay, because the metrics show that if it takes more than 2 seconds, they will get bored and go to another website. So then the development team will not say, well, we are responsible for the definition of done. It's not our problem. This is not the spirit of Scrum. The spirit of Scrum would be to have everyone and say, okay, we have a performance problem. How can we solve it? And typically the way it goes is that the product owner and the development team will collaborate and will address this non-functional requirement, first of all, by creating one or more product backlog items in the product backlog that address this particular issue. For example, the user should not wait more than 2 seconds to load the shopping cart. And the developer team will have some work to do in one of the following sprints. Additionally, what the Scrum team can do as a whole and discuss is the contents of the definition of done, and can put in the definition of done something like, any page on the website, or particularly the cart, or any functionality that we build must load in under 2 seconds. And for even critical parts, maybe they have to load in 1 second. So this can also, after the development team has done some changes to the product or to the system, this can also be added to the definition of done to ensure that whatever the development team does in the future will not break things that they fixed right now. So for example, they fix now that the cart is loading in 2 seconds, but they may, if they're not tracking this, if they're not checking this against the definition of done, they may break it maybe in 2 months, and then it's loading in 3 seconds. And if nobody checks, nobody would know that this is an issue. So this is why it's important to see, of course, input from the entire Scrum team is going into the definition of done. But of course, ultimately and strictly looking at the Scrum Guide, the development team is responsible for creating the definition of done. If, of course, done is not a standard already in the organization, in the development organization. A very technical question here: who accepts the Jira stories during the sprint? Well, any stories, any product backlog items, this is the responsibility of the product owner. So the product owner is the one that is responsible for checking that the work has been done as expected and technically accepting the work. So what happens is that the development team will demonstrate what has been done, can be done in the review, but this typically happens constantly throughout the sprint. As I said, the product owner and the development team constantly talking, constantly collaborating, trying to understand how to move things forward. And this is when this can happen. So the product owner is responsible for this. Another question is, again, regarding the definition of done. And it says, why is the definition of done an input to sprint planning? And the reason for that is, it says actually in the Scrum Guide that the definition of done guides the development team in knowing how many product backlog items to select during the sprint. So what happens is, in the definition of done, there will be technical information regarding the quality of the product. Just to give you an example, if the definition of done doesn't mention any unit testing, of course, the development team will be able to do some work much faster because they don't have to focus so much on testing. Now, if over time they decide and notice, it's not a good idea not to have any unit testing, let's add at least 20%. Now, if they were to implement the exact same functionality, it will take them a bit longer because now they have to write at least 20% of unit testing. And the same if later they decide 20% is still too low, we need to raise it to 70%, then they will, of course, invest more time. So any criteria that's inside the definition of done has an impact on the work. So the higher the quality, of course, the more work needs the development team to do. And for that reason, the amount of typically new features that the development team can implement in the sprint is not a lot. So the capacity will be somehow reduced because they need to invest this time in testing. Okay. So in the chat, I don't see any additional questions. Nobody has raised his or her hand. Then, thank you all for joining this webinar. I hope it was helpful. As always, if you have any questions, simply get in touch with me. I'll be also posting this webinar probably in a few days in the course as well, so that you can rewatch it if you feel like it. Send me your questions, and overall, if something isn't unclear in the course or regarding the exam, or you encounter some questions where you are unsure, just reach out. I'm more than happy to help you. And when you pass the exam, just let me know. How was the load time? How were the questions? Was everything as I explained in the course? Do I need to change something? I'm really basing on your feedback. I'm waiting for it. I'm waiting to see how things went for you. So that's about it. Have a good one. Bye-bye.